Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog of November 1895 clung to Baker Street with the persistence of an unwelcome guest, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a realm of shifting shadows and muffled sounds. I had spent the better part of the evening updating my notes on our recent adventure involving the Boscombe Valley mystery when I became aware that my companion had been unusually silent for the past hour. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary chair beside the fireplace, his long fingers steepled before his aquiline nose, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The violin lay forgotten across his knees, and even his pipe had grown cold in the ashtray beside him. "You are troubled by something, Holmes," I ventured, setting aside my pen. "I have observed that particular expression before, and it invariably precedes one of your more extraordinary deductions." Holmes stirred slightly, his gaze shifting to meet mine with that familiar glint of intellectual curiosity that I had come to associate with the most perplexing of cases. "Indeed, Watson, I have been considering the curious article in this morning's Standard regarding the death of Sir Charles Ashworth. Are you familiar with the particulars?" I confessed that I had not yet had the opportunity to examine the morning papers, having been occupied with my medical journals. Holmes reached for the folded newspaper beside his chair and handed it to me with the deliberate care of a man presenting evidence. "Read the account carefully, my dear fellow. Pay particular attention to the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the body and most especially to the rather theatrical signature left at the scene." The article, positioned prominently on the second page, detailed a most extraordinary crime. Sir Charles Ashworth, the reclusive philanthropist and collector of rare manuscripts, had been found dead in his locked study at his Chelsea residence. The room had been secured from within, with no apparent means of entry or exit available to an intruder. Yet the baronet had clearly met with foul play, as evidenced by a single, precise wound to his chest. Most bizarrely, scrawled across his mahogany desk in what appeared to be the victim's own blood, was a name that sent chills through even the most rational observer: Elias Thorne. "But Holmes," I exclaimed, looking up from the paper, "surely this Elias Thorne is some previously unknown associate or enemy of Sir Charles. The name means nothing to me." "Ah, but it should, Watson. Cast your mind back to the sensational trial of 1880. Elias Thorne was indeed an associate of Sir Charles Ashworth, though hardly a friendly one. The two men were partners in a mining venture in South Africa until accusations of embezzlement and fraud destroyed their relationship. Thorne accused Ashworth of manipulating the books to hide massive losses, while Ashworth maintained that Thorne had been systematically stealing from their investors. The matter ended in a bitter court battle that ruined Thorne's reputation and drove him to an early grave. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November fog seeping through our windows. "You mean to say that this Elias Thorne is dead?" "Dead and buried these 15 years, Watson. I attended his funeral myself, as the case had interested me at the time. Yet here we have his signature, written in blood at the scene of his former partner's murder." Before I could respond to this extraordinary revelation, the sound of rapid footsteps upon our stairs announced an urgent visitor. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in animated conversation with someone in the hallway below, followed by the unmistakable tread of official boots upon our 17 steps. Holmes had already risen from his chair, his entire demeanour transformed from contemplative repose to alert attention. "Inspector Lestrade, unless I am much mistaken," he murmured, moving toward the door. "And he brings with him someone of legal bearing, judging by the measured pace and the slight hesitation before each step. A solicitor, perhaps, or a magistrate, unaccustomed to climbing stairs in haste." The door opened, to reveal not only the familiar figure of Inspector Lestrade, his sharp features marked by frustration and bewilderment, but also a distinguished gentleman whose black coat and grave expression immediately identified him as a member of the legal profession. Lestrade's usually confident demeanour had been replaced by the harried look of a man confronting forces beyond his comprehension. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began without preamble, "I have brought you a case that defies every principle of rational investigation. This is Mr. Geoffrey Whitmore, senior partner of Whitmore and Associates, who served as Sir Charles Ashworth's legal counsel. We are dealing with what appears to be murder committed by a man who has been dead for 15 years. Holmes gestured for our visitors to be seated, his eyes already cataloguing every detail of their appearance and bearing. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his sharp features, lending him an almost supernatural aspect that seemed oddly appropriate given the nature of our case. "Gentlemen," he said, settling back into his chair with the fluid grace of a predator preparing to spring, "I believe you have brought me exactly the sort of impossible problem that makes existence worthwhile. Pray tell me everything you know about the ghost who signed his name." Mr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles with the measured precision of a man whose profession demanded absolute accuracy in all matters. The solicitor's bearing spoke of years spent navigating the complexities of law, yet there was an unmistakable tremor in his voice as he began his account. "Gentlemen, I have served the Ashworth family for nearly 25 years, and never have I encountered circumstances so thoroughly at odds with rational explanation. Sir Charles was discovered at precisely 9:30 this morning by his butler Morton, when the gentleman failed to respond to the customary morning call." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes fixed upon the solicitor, with that penetrating attention I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most incisive inquiries. "Describe the discovery exactly as it occurred, Mr. Whitmore. The smallest detail may prove significant." Morton had knocked at the study door at 9 o'clock, as was his custom, but received no response. Concerned for his master's welfare, he summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, and together they attempted to rouse Sir Charles. When their efforts proved fruitless, they were compelled to force the door with a carpenter's chisel from the kitchen stores. Inspector Lestrade, who had been fidgeting with barely contained frustration, interjected with characteristic bluntness. "The room was locked from within, Mr. Holmes. Not merely locked, but bolted with a heavy iron bar and secured with a chain. Both windows were latched tight, and the room is on the second floor with no possible means of access from outside. Yet there was Sir Charles, slumped over his mahogany desk with a single, precise wound to the heart." "And the weapon?" Holmes inquired, though his tone suggested he anticipated the answer. "None was found," Lestrade replied grimly. "The wound was made by something thin and sharp, like a stiletto or fine letter opener, but we discovered no such instrument anywhere in the room. It's as if the killer simply vanished into the very air." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street with that distant expression that indicated rapid mental calculation. After a moment's contemplation, he turned back to face our visitors, and I observed that familiar glint of intellectual excitement beginning to illuminate his features. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, returning to his seat, "I notice that your usually impeccable appearance bears certain telling details. The ink stain upon your right forefinger suggests you have been writing extensively with a steel nib rather than your customary quill, while the fine white dust upon your cuff indicates recent handling of legal parchment. You have been working late into the night on documents of considerable importance." The solicitor stared at Holmes with undisguised amazement. "Quite correct, Mr. Holmes. I have indeed been preparing Sir Charles's revised will, which he requested only 3 days ago. He seemed most anxious to complete the alterations, though he would not explain his urgency. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "And what of this signature that has so confounded our good inspector? You mentioned in your initial remarks that it bore a disturbing familiarity." Whitmore reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew several yellow documents. "I have brought samples of Elias Thorne's correspondence from our files. The handwriting upon Sir Charles's desk matches these letters with what I can only describe as uncanny precision. Every loop, every flourish appears identical despite the macabre medium in which it was inscribed." "You speak of blood?" Holmes observed. "Have you confirmed that it was indeed Sir Charles's own?" "Dr. Travers, the police surgeon, has examined both the wound and the writing," Lestrade confirmed. "The blood is unquestionably that of the deceased. What's more, the quantity used for the signature corresponds precisely with what would have flowed from such a wound." Holmes's fingers formed their characteristic steeple beneath his chin as he absorbed this information. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, had Sir Charles exhibited any unusual behaviour in recent weeks? Any correspondence, visitors, or alterations to his routine?" "Now that you mention it, Sir Charles did request access to certain files from the original Thorne partnership approximately 3 weeks ago. He claimed to be setting his affairs in order and wished to review the particulars of that unfortunate business. I found the request somewhat curious, as he had previously shown no inclination to revisit those painful memories." "And his household?" Holmes continued. "Who possessed access to his private study?" "The staff is quite small," Whitmore replied, consulting his notes. "Morton, the butler, has been with the family for 15 years. Mrs. Pemberton serves as housekeeper and has proven most reliable in her 12 years of service. There is also young Timothy Walsh, the footman, and Samuel Griggs, the gardener. Sir Charles was most particular about his privacy and rarely permitted anyone into his study save for the weekly cleaning, which was always conducted under his direct supervision." Inspector Lestrade shifted impatiently in his chair, clearly eager to move beyond what he perceived as peripheral details. "Mr. Holmes, surely we must focus on the central impossibility. How does a man dead these 15 years commit murder in a room locked from within? I've examined every inch of that study, questioned every member of the household, and I can find no rational explanation for what appears to be supernatural intervention." Holmes's eyes sparkled with that inner light I had come to associate with his most challenging cases. "Inspector, you speak of impossibilities, yet we live in a universe governed by immutable natural laws. What appears supernatural invariably possesses a perfectly logical explanation once we have assembled sufficient facts to perceive the truth beneath the deception." He moved to his desk and withdrew his magnifying glass, testing its focus against the lamplight with the practiced motion of a craftsman examining his tools. "I shall require immediate access to Sir Charles's residence, gentlemen. The scene must be examined while the evidence remains fresh and undisturbed. Additionally, Mr. Whitmore, I need complete documentation of the original Thorne partnership, including all correspondence, financial records, and transcripts of the court proceedings." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes," the solicitor replied, producing an official document bearing an impressive legal seal. "I have anticipated your requirements. Sir Charles's nephew, Harold Ashworth, has granted you complete authority to examine both the premises and all relevant papers." As our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes moved about the room with renewed energy, gathering the tools of his trade. The fog outside our windows seemed to thicken with the approaching afternoon, lending an appropriately mysterious atmosphere to the extraordinary case that had been laid before us. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice carrying that familiar note of anticipation that preceded our most memorable adventures, I believe we are about to encounter one of the more ingenious deceptions of our career. The ghost of Elias Thorne may indeed walk again, but I suspect we shall find that his supernatural abilities extend only to the realm of human cunning and carefully orchestrated illusion. Fetch your coat and medical bag. We have an appointment with a phantom who has apparently acquired a most corporeal talent for murder. The hansom cab carried us through the thickening fog toward Chelsea, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves muffled by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against the very windows of our conveyance. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the gaslight from passing street lamps, while Inspector Lestrade fidgeted with barely contained impatience across from us. The fog had grown so dense that familiar landmarks appeared and vanished like phantoms, lending an appropriately mysterious quality to our journey toward what promised to be one of our most perplexing cases. "Holmes," I ventured, as we turned onto the King's Road, "what are your initial thoughts regarding this apparent impossibility? Surely you do not credit the supernatural explanation that seems to have so thoroughly confounded our good inspector." My companion turned from the window with that familiar expression of barely contained intellectual excitement that I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases. "Watson, in my experience, the most seemingly impossible crimes invariably prove to be the most elegantly simple once the proper perspective is achieved. The locked room, the vanished weapon, the signature of a dead man, each element appears designed to confound rational investigation. Yet therein lies our first clue. This crime was not committed in passion or desperation, but was carefully orchestrated to create precisely the mystifying effect we have witnessed. You suggest deliberate misdirection. I suggest something far more sophisticated than mere misdirection, my dear fellow. Consider the theatrical nature of the scene. Someone of flesh and blood committed this murder, and that someone possessed intimate knowledge of both the Ashworth household and the tragic history of Elias Thorne. Sir Charles Ashworth's residence in Cheyne Walk presented a sober face to the river, its elegant Georgian facade now bearing the sombre atmosphere of a house touched by violent death. The great windows remained dim behind drawn curtains, while a constable stood guard at the front entrance, his breath forming white plumes in the chill air. As we approached, I noted that Holmes had already begun his characteristic observation of details that would escape the notice of ordinary men. We were admitted by Morton, a grave man with iron-grey hair and the trained immobility of a well-schooled servant. Despite his professional composure, I detected a subtle tremor in his hands and a haunted quality in his eyes that spoke to the profound shock of his morning's discovery. Grief had carved fresh lines beside his mouth, yet he maintained the quiet efficiency of his station as he led us through the hall with its sombre portraits and up the wide stair to the second floor. "Mr. Holmes," he said with formal precision, "Inspector Lestrade has instructed that the study remains exactly as it was found, save for the examination by Dr. Travers. I trust you will find everything in order for your investigation." Holmes acknowledged the butler's greeting with a brief nod before turning his attention to our surroundings. His grey eyes swept the polished marble floors, the oil paintings adorning the walls, and the grand staircase with systematic thoroughness. "Morton, you have served Sir Charles for 15 years, I understand. Tell me, had your master's habits or demeanour altered in any way during recent weeks?" The butler's composure wavered slightly as he considered the question. "Sir Charles had indeed seemed troubled of late, sir. He spent increasing amounts of time in his study, often working late into the night. On several occasions I heard him speaking aloud, though when I inquired whether he required anything, he assured me he was merely reading correspondence aloud for clarity." The study door bore the violent marks of forced entry, the splintered jamb telling its own story of desperation and discovery. "You see the marks where the chain gave way under the carpenter's chisel," Lestrade explained, indicating the damaged wood. "The bolt was thrown, the chain set, and the key turned in the inner lock." Within, the study breathed the intellectual life of its master. Bookcases rose in 3 ranks to the ceiling, their glass-fronted doors reflecting the low fire that still smouldered in the grate. A great globe, dulled by years of scholarly touch, stood in the window bay, while Persian carpets covered the polished floors. Upon the centre of it all stood the massive mahogany desk where the tragedy had unfolded, its green-shaded lamp casting eerie shadows across the scene of violence. The most chilling sight was the name Elias Thorne scrawled across the desktop in broad crimson characters, formed with a steadiness that made my skin crawl. The letters maintained uniform pressure and spacing despite being written in what was unmistakably dried blood, suggesting careful deliberation rather than desperate haste. Holmes approached the desk with the reverent attention of a scholar examining a precious manuscript. He withdrew his magnifying glass and began a minute examination of the blood-stained surface, his movements deliberate and methodical. I observed him paying particular attention to a small porcelain water cup near the lamp, its rim bearing a reddish stain inside the lip. Moving to the windows, Holmes examined the latches and frames with equal thoroughness. The casements held firm, their inner catches fast, and the sashes painted to fit. A thin crust of dust lay upon the inner sill, save for a narrow oval just large enough for a thumbprint, freshly smudged. With delicate precision, he lifted a blonde filament from the carpet and preserved it between 2 cards. He next turned to the hearth, where the fire was dying to red embers beneath a drift of ash. With the poker, he teased out a jagged scrap of stiffened paper not yet wholly consumed, smoothing it carefully with a wetted finger. I could make out only the corner of a watermark and a few letters in copperplate script before it crumbled, but Holmes secured a second remnant of heavier material, like thin vellum, impressed with part of a seal. Kneeling beside the threshold, Holmes examined the splintered wood with intense concentration, noting not merely the obvious damage but the subtle patterns of the breaks and the direction of the force. There, barely perceptible, was a faint polishing upon the wood where it met the floorboards, as if some fine cord had passed to and fro under tension. A tiny filament, no more than a hair's breadth of black silk, clung to the damaged wood, which he gathered with patient exactness. Holmes's attention focused particularly on the area surrounding the desk, testing the floorboards with gentle pressure as though searching for some hidden mechanism. He examined the chair where Sir Charles had been found, noting a faint, fresh abrasion on its back, where the wood showed recent damage. The carpet beneath revealed far less blood than the desk surface might have suggested, a discrepancy that clearly intrigued my companion. "Morton," Holmes called to the butler, who had remained respectfully in the doorway. "Who last saw Sir Charles alive?" "I did, sir," Morton replied. "At 10:15 last evening, when I carried in his tisane. He dismissed me at once, and I heard the bolt slide home as I withdrew down the corridor." "And yesterday afternoon? I understand he received visitors." "His nephew, Mr. Harold Ashworth, called at 3 o'clock. There was also a messenger with a parcel near 5, and Mrs. Pemberton mentioned hearing voices through the study door around 6, Sir Charles's certainly, and a lower tone she could not place, though he would sometimes read aloud to himself." Holmes moved to examine the desk drawers, one of which stood slightly ajar. Within lay ordered bundles of correspondence tied in blue tape, save for an empty space marked by the dust shadow of a missing ledger. In the centre drawer, a key hook lay conspicuously bare. As the afternoon light began to fade through the tall windows, Holmes completed his meticulous examination with that air of quiet satisfaction I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant revelation. Yet he offered no immediate explanation of his discoveries, instead turning to address our small gathering with characteristic precision. "The murderer was certainly present in this room," he announced finally, straightening from his examination of the carpet. "The question that remains is not whether he was here, but rather how he managed to accomplish his purpose and vanish so completely afterward. The answer to that question, Watson, will unlock the entire mystery of our ghostly correspondent." He moved toward the door, pausing to examine once more the damaged frame and the peculiar polishing marks he had discovered. "Inspector Lestrade, I shall require interviews with every member of the household, beginning with Mrs. Pemberton. Additionally, that messenger who delivered the afternoon parcel must be traced immediately. Mr. Whitmore, I need access to Sir Charles's strong-box and any recent correspondence he may have received regarding the Thorne partnership." The fog outside had grown so thick that the gas lamps in the street below appeared as mere halos of light, lending an otherworldly quality to the scene. As we prepared to leave the study, I could not shake the feeling that we had witnessed only the opening act of a drama whose true complexity had yet to be revealed. Holmes's methodical gathering of seemingly insignificant details suggested that beneath the supernatural appearance of this crime lay a web of deception far more intricate than any of us had yet imagined. Mrs. Pemberton received us in the morning room, her composed demeanour barely concealing the profound shock that had shaken the household's foundations. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the tea service, though her voice remained steady when Holmes began his methodical questioning. The housekeeper had served the Ashworth family for 12 years, and her testimony would prove crucial to understanding the events of the previous evening. "Sir Charles had been most particular about his privacy these recent weeks, Mr. Holmes," she began, dabbing at her eyes with a well-worn handkerchief. "Yesterday evening, around 6:30, I distinctly heard him conversing with someone in his study. His voice seemed strained, almost agitated, and there was another voice responding, much lower in tone, though I could not make out the words through the heavy oak door." Holmes leaned forward with that penetrating attention I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. "You are certain?" There was a second voice. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Sir Charles was known to read aloud when sorting his papers. "Quite certain, sir. I have served in this household long enough to know the difference between solitary reading and genuine conversation." There was a distinct pattern of question and response that continued for nearly 20 minutes. Holmes rose and moved to examine a loose thread on the woman's sleeve, holding it to the light with apparent interest before tucking it into his waistcoat pocket. "Tell me about the portrait cord in the study. I noticed the painting of Lady Ashworth above the fireplace." "Why, I replaced that very cord just 2 days past, sir. The old one had frayed near the ring, so Timothy and I installed a new black silk cord, much stronger than the previous one. There were lengths left over which I kept in my sewing basket, though I cannot now locate that particular roll." The significance of this revelation was not lost on Holmes, whose eyes glinted with that familiar spark of deduction. We next interviewed Timothy Walsh, the young footman whose nervous energy betrayed his distress over the morning's discovery. His account of the mysterious messenger proved particularly illuminating. "The man arrived near 5 o'clock, sir, claiming to represent Hartwell and Company. He was slight in build, poorly dressed, with a cloth cap pulled low over his face. What struck me as odd was how well he knew the household routines, addressing me by name and knowing precisely where to find the servants' entrance. The parcel was heavier than its size suggested and seemed to contain multiple objects that shifted when carried." Holmes questioned the lad closely about the messenger's appearance. eliciting details that grew more significant with each inquiry. The man had worn a dark overcoat of surprising quality despite his shabby appearance, and his hands bore the telltale ink stains of someone accustomed to handling documents. Most intriguingly, Timothy had noticed a heavy gold signet ring bearing what appeared to be a coat of arms. Our final interview was with Harold Ashworth himself, who had arrived in response to Mr. Whitmore's urgent telegram. The young man presented a composed facade, dressed in appropriate mourning attire, yet I detected subtle signs of nervousness that Holmes undoubtedly observed with far greater precision. His account of the previous day's visit seemed almost rehearsed in its completeness. I called upon Uncle Charles around 3 o'clock to discuss his revised will, Harold explained with careful precision. He seemed quite content, even cheerful, saying he was finally putting some old demons to rest. We spoke for perhaps an hour before I departed for my club, where I remained until late evening playing billiards with Lord Fenwick and Mr. Davies. Holmes studied the young man with surgical intensity, noting details that escaped my observation. "Your uncle mentioned old demons, specifically. Did he elaborate on their nature?" "He was always rather private about his affairs, Mr. Holmes. I assumed he referred to the general burdens of his past, perhaps the unfortunate business with Elias Thorne, though he rarely spoke of such matters directly." As Harold provided his alibi with practiced ease, Holmes examined the man's gloves when requested, returning them without comment, though I observed him noting what appeared to be a faint stain upon the inner seam. The interview concluded with Harold's departure, leaving behind an atmosphere of carefully controlled suspicion. Following these interviews, Mr. Whitmore opened Sir Charles's strong box, revealing among the neatly docketed papers a recent note that made my blood run cold. Posted 3 days earlier from Blackfriars, it contained but one sentence, written in a firm, old-fashioned hand. "It is time you answered me, Charles. E.T." When compared to the Thorne letters in Whitmore's possession, the handwriting proved identical in every particular. Inspector Lestrade's satisfaction was evident as he examined this damning evidence. "There you have it, Mr. Holmes. The nephew, angry over a will, a staged haunting to cover murder, and convenient alibis all around. The case points straight enough for my taste." Holmes, however, remained unconvinced by such linear reasoning. "Straight lines are admirable in Euclid, Inspector, but they are rare in human conduct. The evidence we have gathered suggests a deception far more sophisticated than simple family discord." As we prepared to leave the study, Holmes's demeanour had undergone that subtle transformation I had learned to recognise as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. The fog outside continued to press against the windows like a living thing, while within the house the ghost of Elias Thorne seemed to whisper secrets that only my remarkable companion was beginning to comprehend. "Watson," Holmes announced as we gathered our coats, "I believe we are dealing with a criminal mind of exceptional cunning. The locked room, the vanished weapon, the supernatural signature, each element has been carefully orchestrated to create precisely the mystifying effect we have witnessed. Tomorrow we shall trace that mysterious messenger and examine the contents of that Fleet Street parcel. I suspect we shall find that both Hartwell and Company and the ghost of Elias Thorne exist only in the realm of elaborate deception." The following morning brought a subtle shift in the oppressive fog that had shrouded London, though the grey veil still clung to the streets with persistent determination. Holmes had risen before dawn, and I discovered him already immersed in a systematic examination of the evidence we had gathered, his breakfast growing cold beside an array of specimens arranged with scientific precision. The silk filament from the doorframe lay pinned beneath his powerful magnifying glass, while the vellum fragment from Sir Charles's hearth rested in a shallow dish of chemical solution. "Watson," he announced without lifting his gaze from the microscope. "Observe the peculiar twist of this silk thread. This is not common household cord, but rather specialized rigging line of the type employed in theatrical productions. Note the distinctive weave pattern and the unusual tensile strength designed to bear considerable weight while remaining nearly invisible to observers." His observation proved prophetic as our morning's investigation unfolded. Our first destination was Fleet Street, where Holmes's methodical inquiries regarding the mysterious Hartwell and Company yielded results both illuminating and disturbing. The address provided by Timothy Walsh's messenger corresponded to a narrow building that had stood vacant for the past 6 months, its windows boarded and premises secured by iron chains. The neighbouring tobacconist, however, proved a valuable source of information. "Seen him regular-like these past weeks," the man informed us, his weathered face creased with concentration. "Well-dressed gentleman, always kept his hat pulled low and wore a fine dark overcoat despite trying to appear common. Had the manner of quality about him, though he seemed mighty interested in that empty building, saw him coming and going at odd hours, sometimes carrying packages or cases." Holmes questioned the man closely, eliciting details that aligned disturbingly with our growing composite of the mysterious figure who seemed to move through London's shadows with such deliberate purpose. Most significantly, the tobacconist had observed this individual as recently as 3 days previous, entering the vacant premises with what appeared to be a substantial leather case. Our investigation next led us to the theatrical district, where Holmes's extensive knowledge of London's more specialised establishments brought us to Wickham's theatrical suppliers in Drury Lane. The proprietor, a garrulous man with ink-stained fingers, and the enthusiastic manner of one passionate about his craft, examined the silk fragment with professional interest. "That's our finest rigging line, gentlemen," Wickham confirmed with evident pride. "Specially manufactured for the Lyceum Theatre's new production, though we've supplied several other establishments this past month, strong enough to support a full-grown man, yet thin enough to remain invisible from the orchestra seats. Most recently, we sold a considerable length to a gentleman who claimed to require it for a private entertainment." The description that emerged from Wickham's recollection matched our mysterious figure with unsettling precision. The purchaser had demonstrated detailed knowledge of theatrical rigging techniques, asking specific questions about load-bearing capacity and installation methods that suggested professional familiarity with such equipment. Most intriguingly, he had insisted on immediate delivery rather than the customary arrangement, paying in cash and departing with obvious haste. Returning to our lodgings, Holmes devoted the afternoon to a series of physical experiments that would have appeared eccentric to any observer unfamiliar with his methods. Using samples of the theatrical cord, he tested various configurations of pulleys and tensions, measuring the force required to operate door mechanisms from a distance. His sitting room soon resembled a peculiar laboratory, with lengths of silk thread stretched at calculated angles and mechanical apparatus arranged with mathematical precision. The locked room presents no insurmountable obstacle once we understand the proper application of leverage and timing, Holmes explained, as he demonstrated how a carefully positioned cord could manipulate both bolt and chain from outside the secured chamber. Our murderer possessed not supernatural powers, but rather a thorough understanding of mechanical principles and theatrical staging. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore's financial records revealed a pattern that grew more sinister with each revelation. Sir Charles had made 3 substantial cash withdrawals during the past month, each transaction conducted personally rather than through his usual banking agent. The amounts totaled nearly £1,500, a sum that suggested preparation for some significant obligation or expenditure. "Note the timing, Watson," Holmes observed, indicating the dates in Sir Charles's banking ledger. Each withdrawal corresponds precisely with the periods when our mysterious gentleman was observed at the vacant Fleet Street premises. The pattern suggests a systematic campaign of extortion or blackmail, with Sir Charles compelled to meet increasingly desperate demands. As evening approached and the fog began to thicken once more, Holmes's demeanour had undergone that subtle transformation I had learned to associate with the approach of significant revelation. Yet he remained characteristically reticent about his conclusions, preferring to allow the evidence to accumulate until the complete picture emerged with undeniable clarity. "Tomorrow, Watson," he announced as we prepared for our evening meal, "we must examine the one element of this puzzle that continues to elude explanation. The weapon that killed Sir Charles vanished completely from a locked room, yet such an object cannot simply cease to exist. When we determine how our murderer disposed of his implement, we shall have solved the central impossibility of this most ingenious crime." The fog pressed against our windows with renewed intensity as night fell over London, while within our sitting room the flickering gaslight cast dancing shadows that seemed to echo the phantoms we pursued. Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in contemplation, his violin singing haunting melodies that spoke of mysteries yet to be unravelled, and truths that lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The third morning of our investigation brought Dr. Travers to the Ashworth residence, his medical bag in hand and his precise manner lending scientific authority to our continued examination of the crime scene. Holmes had requested this return visit specifically to clarify certain medical aspects of Sir Charles's death that had been troubling his methodical mind. The surgeon's post-mortem findings proved illuminating in ways that would soon reshape our entire understanding of the case. The wound penetrated between the fourth and fifth ribs, Dr. Travers explained, indicating his detailed anatomical sketch, passing cleanly into the heart at a slight downward angle. Most significantly, Mr. Holmes, there were no hesitation marks, no defensive wounds, and no signs of struggle. This suggests either complete surprise or that the victim knew and trusted his attacker sufficiently to allow such close proximity. Holmes absorbed this information with that intense concentration I had learned to associate with significant breakthroughs. "The angle of entry, Doctor, could you be more specific about the trajectory?" "The blade entered from slightly above and to the victim's right, suggesting the attacker stood behind or beside Sir Charles as he sat at his desk. Death would have been virtually instantaneous, with only enough time for perhaps 2 or 3 heartbeats before consciousness was lost." With Dr. Travers's departure, Holmes began what proved to be his most thorough examination of the study yet undertaken. Armed with his magnifying glass and a selection of small tools, he approached the massive mahogany desk with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. His attention focused particularly upon the underside of the writing surface, where his careful probing revealed a discovery that sent a thrill of excitement through his entire frame. "Watson, observe this minute brass fitting," he announced, indicating a tiny screw-eye that had been recently installed in the wood beneath the desk. The metal showed no signs of age or oxidation, while fresh wood shavings still clung to the surrounding grain. "Note the positioning directly above where Sir Charles would have sat, and aligned with that curious scratch we observed on the doorframe." His systematic search yielded additional evidence that painted an increasingly clear picture of mechanical sophistication. A fragment of steel, no larger than a pinhead, clung to his magnet when passed along the crack between the floorboards. The hearth surrendered a blistered scale of tempered metal that bore traces of machine oil and tallow. Most significantly, a second examination of the portrait cord revealed a thinner strand that had been spliced to the main line and subsequently cut away, leaving only the smallest remnant behind the frame. "The pattern becomes clear, Watson," Holmes explained as he completed his circuit of the room. "Our murderer employed a system of theatrical rigging that would have done credit to the finest stage productions. The weapon itself was withdrawn from the scene through mechanical means, leaving no trace save these minute fragments of its passage. As if summoned by the very mention of mechanical contrivances, a commotion in the street below drew our attention to the windows. Harold Ashworth's carriage had drawn up before the house, but the young man who emerged bore little resemblance to the composed individual we had interviewed previously. His face was pale with terror, his hands trembled visibly, and his entire demeanour spoke of a man who had gazed upon his own mortality and found the experience profoundly disturbing. Morton admitted Harold with obvious concern, and the young man's account of his morning's experience sent a chill through even Holmes's analytical composure. Returning to his Belgravia residence after spending the night at his club, Harold had discovered a package awaiting him in his private study. The wrapping bore no indication of its sender, while the contents proved to be a small wooden box of exquisite craftsmanship, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl in patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. "I thought it might be some memento from Uncle Charles's collection," Harold explained, his voice barely above a whisper. When I lifted the lid, a mechanism sprang into action. A thin steel needle shot forth with tremendous force, missing my head by mere inches and embedding itself in the oak panelling behind me. Holmes examined the needle that Harold had carefully extracted from the wall, noting its unusual length and the crystalline residue that coated its point. "This substance requires immediate analysis," he announced, wrapping the implement in his handkerchief. "Dr. Travers must determine whether we are dealing with a simple mechanical trap or something far more sinister." The wooden box itself proved equally revealing under Holmes's scrutiny. The mechanism within showed the same precision craftsmanship we had observed in the study's rigging system, while a small parchment scroll bore a single word written in what appeared to be dried blood: Thorn. "The escalation is deliberate and calculated," Holmes observed, his grey eyes reflecting the gravity of our situation. "Our adversary has moved from murder to attempted murder, from concealment to open threat. This suggests either growing desperation or increasing confidence in his ability to evade detection." Harold's terror was palpable as he described the mysterious visitors who had called upon him during recent weeks, always arriving at odd hours and conducting their business in whispered conversations that left him increasingly uneasy. Like his uncle, Harold had made substantial cash withdrawals that corresponded precisely with these visits, though he claimed ignorance of their true purpose. "They spoke of old debts and family obligations," Harold stammered, his composure cracking under the weight of accumulated fear. "I assumed they referred to Uncle Charles's business affairs, but now I fear something far more sinister was intended." As the afternoon light began to fade through the tall windows, Holmes's demeanour underwent that subtle transformation I had learned to associate with the approach of decisive action. The various threads of evidence were clearly weaving themselves into a coherent pattern within his remarkable mind, though he remained characteristically reticent about revealing his complete conclusions. "Watson," he announced as we prepared to leave the study, "our phantom correspondent has made a critical error in escalating his campaign of terror. By threatening Harold directly, he has revealed both his desperation and his location. Tomorrow, we shall turn the hunter into the hunted, and I believe our ghost of Elias Thorne will discover that the living possess certain advantages over the dead when it comes to matters of detection and pursuit." The fog had begun to thicken once more as we departed the Ashworth residence, lending an appropriately mysterious atmosphere to our contemplation of this increasingly complex case. Holmes spent the journey in profound silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose that indicated rapid mental calculation. I could sense that the final act of our drama was approaching, though the complete resolution remained tantalizingly beyond my grasp. "Tomorrow," Holmes murmured as our hansom drew up before Baker Street, "we shall set our trap for this most theatrical of criminals. The stage is prepared, the players are in position, and I believe our phantom will find that his final performance may prove to be his last." Dr. Travers arrived at Baker Street with the dawn light, his analysis of the crystalline residue confirming Holmes's gravest suspicions. The needle that had so narrowly missed Harold Ashworth bore traces of aconitine, that deadly derivative of monkshood whose effects would have rendered death both swift and apparently natural. This revelation transformed our understanding from mere theatrical murder to a systematic campaign of elimination employing the most sophisticated methods of assassination. The concentration was precisely calibrated, Dr. Travers explained, consulting his detailed notes. A single scratch would have induced cardiac paralysis within minutes, leaving symptoms that might easily be attributed to natural causes. Our adversary possesses not only mechanical ingenuity, but also considerable knowledge of exotic toxicology. Holmes received this intelligence with that grim satisfaction I had learned to associate with the confirmation of his most serious deductions. "Watson, we are dealing with someone who has devoted considerable study to the art of undetectable murder. The escalation from Sir Charles's direct wound to this elaborate poisoned mechanism suggests a mind that revels in both precision and theatrical effect." The Morning Post brought word from Inspector Lestrade that the vacant Fleet Street premises had shown fresh signs of occupation despite its apparently abandoned state. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of intellectual excitement as he absorbed this information, and I observed him making rapid calculations that would soon crystallize into decisive action. "The time for passive observation has ended," Holmes announced, rising from his chair with renewed energy. "Our phantom has grown bold through success, but boldness breeds carelessness. Today we shall transform the hunter into the hunted." By afternoon, we had established ourselves in a disused printing office directly opposite the mysterious building, its grimy windows providing an unobstructed view of the narrow entrance. Lestrade had positioned his men with characteristic efficiency, their presence invisible yet decisive. Holmes himself occupied a commanding position on the adjacent rooftop, his field glasses sweeping the approaches with methodical precision. As dusk settled over the great thoroughfare, transforming familiar landmarks into a realm of shifting shadows and muffled sounds, our vigil was rewarded. A figure emerged from the fog with the deliberate movements of someone intimately familiar with his surroundings. Well-dressed, despite his attempts at concealment, the man approached the building with a confidence that spoke of long association with the premises. Holmes's prearranged signal confirmed what we had all observed. Our quarry had returned to his lair. The figure produced a key that engaged not the visible lock, but some inner mechanism, disappearing into the building with practiced stealth. Within moments, a thin line of light appeared along a shuttered window, confirming his presence within. We allowed him sufficient time to settle before making our approach. The interior revealed itself as a workshop of the most ingenious villainy, its tables bearing the tools of precision engineering alongside apparatus that spoke of dangerous experimentation. Mechanical devices in various stages of completion occupied every surface, while detailed diagrams covered the walls showing rigging systems of theatrical complexity. Most significantly, a collection of correspondence bore multiple signatures and postmarks, suggesting our adversary had been conducting business under various identities throughout London. The handwriting samples included dozens of practice attempts at reproducing Elias Thorne with mechanical precision, each iteration refined until the signature achieved perfect consistency. Holmes examined a shallow porcelain dish stained with dried residue, nodding with professional appreciation. "A reservoir system for maintaining consistent line pressure," he murmured. Our phantom signature was not traced in desperate haste, but written with the calm deliberation of a master forger. The sound of movement from the rear chamber alerted us to immediate danger. Holmes extinguished the lamp with practiced efficiency, but our quarry had detected our presence. The struggle that followed was brief but violent, ending with the man's escape through a prepared route that spoke of long planning and intimate knowledge of the building's structure. Though he had vanished into the labyrinth of Fleet Street's connecting rooftops, the night was not without its rewards. A gentleman's glove, bearing the stamp of a Jermyn Street outfitter, lay abandoned in his haste, while a precision-made pulley of polished brass bore the manufacturer's distinctive mark. Most tellingly, scattered papers revealed a systematic study of the Ashworth family's movements and habits, annotated with the thoroughness of a professional assassin. "He has left us his calling cards in abundance," Holmes observed, examining the abandoned equipment with satisfaction. "A gentleman's accessories, a craftsman's tools, and a scholar's methodology. We are narrowing our field considerably." Among the papers, a leather portfolio contained documents that sent a chill through my very soul. Copies of the original Thorne partnership agreements bearing marginal notes in a modern hand, alongside recent photographs of both Sir Charles and Harold taken without their knowledge. The scope of surveillance and preparation spoke to a campaign of revenge planned with military precision over an extended period. "Tomorrow," Holmes announced as we catalogued the evidence, "we shall trace these material clues to their source. Our ghost's mask grows thin, Watson, and I believe we shall soon discover that the dead Elias Thorne has acquired a very living agent of vengeance." The fog pressed against the windows with renewed intensity as we departed, while behind us the abandoned workshop stood as testament to a brilliant mind perverted to the service of theatrical murder and systematic revenge. The following morning brought Holmes to our investigation with that methodical precision I had learned to associate with his most significant breakthroughs. The gentleman's glove from our Fleet Street discovery had yielded secrets under his systematic examination, revealing not merely the maker's distinctive craftsmanship, but a subtle monogram embroidered in silk thread so fine as to be nearly invisible to casual observation. The initials RT were worked into the leather with exquisite care, providing our first concrete clue to the identity of our phantom adversary. Our inquiries began at the distinguished establishment in Jermyn Street whose mark adorned the abandoned glove. The proprietor, a meticulous craftsman whose attention to detail rivaled Holmes's own, consulted his private ledgers with professional pride. The gloves had been commissioned 18 months prior by one Richard Thorne, who had provided a Bloomsbury address and specified the finest materials throughout. Most particular about the monogramming, the craftsman recalled, examining his detailed notes. Insisted upon silk thread of exceptional quality and requested that the initials remain subtle while maintaining perfect legibility under magnification. He seemed a gentleman of considerable refinement, though there was something melancholy about his bearing that suggested old sorrows. The revelation of that surname sent a thrill of recognition through both Holmes and myself. Here at last was the connection we had sought, not the ghostly return of Elias Thorne himself, but the very real presence of his son, driven by filial devotion and a burning desire for justice. Holmes's subsequent inquiries at Somerset House confirmed our deductions with startling completeness. Richard Elias Thorne had been born in Cape Town in 1865, the only child of Elias Thorne and his wife, Margaret, who had died in childbirth. Following his father's disgrace and early death, the boy had been raised by relatives in South Africa, receiving an exceptional education that included studies at Cambridge and specialized training at the Royal School of Mines. "The pattern becomes unmistakably clear, Watson," Holmes explained as we reviewed these discoveries. "Young Richard Thorne has devoted his adult life to avenging what he perceives as his father's wrongful destruction. Sir Charles Ashworth represented not merely a business partner who had betrayed his trust, but the architect of his family's ruin and his father's premature death." Our afternoon investigation traced Richard Thorne's movements through London's academic and professional circles, where his reputation as a brilliant engineer had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The Royal Institution's records showed attendance at lectures on precision mechanics and metallurgy, while his association with several theatrical companies had provided practical experience in the very rigging systems we had observed in both the Fleet Street workshop and Sir Charles's study. The engineering firm in Bermondsey, whose brass pulley we had recovered, proved equally illuminating. The foreman remembered Richard Thorne as a customer of exceptional technical knowledge who had ordered specialized components for what he described as mechanical stage effects. The precision and complexity of his requirements had impressed even these experienced craftsmen, while his understanding of leverage, counterweights, and remote activation systems demonstrated expertise that could only have been acquired through years of dedicated study. "He spoke like a man who understood every principle of force and motion," the foreman recalled with professional admiration, asked questions that showed he'd thought through every aspect of his project, down to the smallest detail of stress and timing. Upon our return to the Ashworth residence, we discovered Inspector Lestrade in a state of considerable excitement over what he believed to be a breakthrough in the case. Acting upon information received through his network of informants, he had ordered a search of young Timothy Walsh's quarters, where a roll of black silk, cord identical to that used in the study's rigging system, had been discovered hidden among the footman's possessions. Holmes examined the evidence with that cool detachment I had learned to associate with his most penetrating analyses. Requesting a basin of warm water and a magnifying glass, he demonstrated within moments that the cord bore traces of lampblack and resin applied externally to mimic the theatrical line's distinctive finish. More significantly, the cut ends showed the irregular fraying characteristic of a dull kitchen knife rather than the clean severance that marked the genuine article, a stage property planted by someone who understands the principles of misdirection but lacks the craftsman's attention to authentic detail, Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction. "Our adversary grows desperate, Inspector, and desperation breeds carelessness, even in the most methodical of minds." The afternoon brought Mr. Whitmore to the residence bearing documents that cast new light upon Sir Charles's final intentions. The revised will contained provisions that would have sent shockwaves through London's financial circles, a substantial fund dedicated to the public restitution of investors in the original Thorne partnership, to be administered with complete transparency and independent audit. Sir Charles spoke of righting an ancient wrong, Whitmore explained with evident emotion. He wished to compel full disclosure of that unfortunate business, regardless of the personal cost to his reputation. The sums involved were considerable, and the publicity would have been inevitable. Holmes absorbed this information with that intense concentration that preceded his most brilliant deductions. Such a measure would have vindicated Elias Thorne's memory while exposing the true circumstances of the partnership's collapse. For a son devoted to his father's honour, this gesture might have represented either complete satisfaction or the ultimate frustration of a carefully planned revenge. As evening approached, Holmes's demeanour underwent that subtle transformation I had learned to associate with the approach of decisive action. The various threads of evidence had woven themselves into a coherent pattern that revealed not merely Richard Thorne's identity, but the full scope of his systematic campaign of vengeance. "We are dealing with a formidable adversary, Watson," Holmes observed, as we prepared for what promised to be our final confrontation. Richard Thorne possesses the technical brilliance of his father combined with the passionate intensity of youth. His mechanical genius, theatrical flair, and intimate knowledge of the original partnership have created what may be the most ingenious series of crimes I have encountered. The Evening Post brought a communication that confirmed Holmes's assessment of our adversary's growing desperation. A letter addressed to Holmes himself bore the now familiar signature of Elias Thorne, written in what appeared to be dried blood, its message brief but chilling in its implications. "You have interfered with justice long enough, Mr. Holmes. The final accounting begins at midnight." Holmes examined the letter with professional interest, noting details of paper, postal markings, and the subtle tremor in the handwriting that suggested emotional strain beneath the calculated precision. "Young Thorne grows impatient with our investigation, Watson. This direct challenge indicates that his carefully orchestrated plan has been disrupted by our discoveries. He seeks to force a confrontation on his terms, but I believe we may transform this apparent disadvantage into the means of his capture." As the fog began to thicken once more outside our windows, Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in preparation for what promised to be the climactic encounter of our most theatrical case. His movements carried that deliberate precision I had learned to associate with moments of supreme danger, while his eyes held the steady light of a man who had gazed into the heart of human vengeance and found himself equal to its challenge. "Tomorrow, Watson," he announced, as the gas lamps flickered to life along the darkening street, "we shall finally meet the ghost of Elias Thorne face to face. I believe young Richard will discover that while the dead may inspire the living to extraordinary acts of devotion, they cannot shield them from the consequences of murder, most ingeniously planned but imperfectly executed." The midnight challenge from Richard Thorne had galvanized Holmes into a state of focused intensity that I had rarely witnessed even during our most perilous adventures. The hours preceding our appointed confrontation were spent in meticulous preparation, transforming Sir Charles's study into an elaborate trap that would have impressed even our theatrically minded adversary. Holmes positioned Inspector Lestrade and his constables throughout the house with military precision, while Harold Ashworth, despite his obvious terror, agreed to play his crucial role in our carefully orchestrated drama. Our young friend believes he has chosen both the stage and the script for tonight's performance, Holmes observed as he made final adjustments to his preparations. But every great playwright knows that the most effective revelations come when the audience least expects them. The study had been transformed into a subtle snare that utilized Richard Thorne's own mechanical principles against him. Holmes had weakened the portrait cord at a precise point, arranged a nearly invisible tripwire across the carpet, and applied his distinctive iodine chalk mixture to surfaces that would reveal our adversary's movements with scientific precision. Most significantly, he had positioned a false ledger upon the desk, a decoy designed to draw Thorne's attention while concealing the true evidence that would shatter his carefully constructed worldview. As the long case clock in the hall struck midnight, the appointed hour arrived with ominous punctuality. The first indication of Richard Thorne's presence came through that subtle alteration in atmospheric pressure that accompanies the opening of distant doors, followed by the barely perceptible scrape of metal against wood as the window latch yielded to skilled manipulation. The figure that emerged from the fog-shrouded darkness moved with the fluid confidence of a man who believed himself master of every circumstance. Richard Thorne stepped into the lamplight with theatrical precision, his lean frame and steady hands marking him as the precision craftsman we had anticipated. His features bore a striking resemblance to the daguerreotype of his father that we had studied, though where Elias Thorne's face had shown the weathered lines of commercial disappointment, his son's countenance reflected the focused determination of a man consumed by a single, burning purpose. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, in cultured accents that carried the authority of Cambridge education, tempered by colonial directness, "I had hoped our business might be concluded without this personal encounter, but your persistence has made such a meeting inevitable." Holmes rose from his position behind the desk with that fluid grace I had observed in moments of supreme danger. "Mr. Richard Thorne, I presume. Your father would have been proud of the ingenuity you have displayed, though perhaps less pleased with the purposes to which you have applied your considerable talents." "You speak of my father as though you knew him," Richard replied, his hand moving toward his coat pocket with calculated precision. "Yet you cannot comprehend the injustice that destroyed his life and drove him to an early grave. Sir Charles Ashworth was not merely a business partner who betrayed his trust. He was the architect of a conspiracy that robbed honest investors and destroyed my family's honor." The mechanical device he withdrew represented the culmination of his engineering brilliance applied to murderous purpose. No larger than a gentleman's pocket watch, its polished brass surface concealed a spring-loaded mechanism of devastating efficiency, its steel needle gleaming with that same crystalline residue we had observed on Harold's trap. Holmes observed the weapon with professional interest while maintaining his strategic position. "Your mechanical ingenuity is remarkable, Mr. Thorne. The rigging system you employed demonstrated a thorough understanding of theatrical principles combined with engineering precision. Yet I fear your campaign of vengeance has been founded upon a fundamental misunderstanding." "Impossible," Richard whispered, though uncertainty flickered across his composed features. "The documents we discovered prove conclusively that neither your father nor Sir Charles bore responsibility for the partnership's collapse," Holmes continued with relentless logic. "The true villain was Marcus Fleming, the company's accountant who systematically embezzled funds while manipulating the books to implicate both partners. Sir Charles spent his final months gathering proof of Fleming's guilt, intending to clear both his own name and your father's memory." The revelation struck Richard Thorne with devastating force, his weapon wavering as years of carefully constructed certainties crumbled. In that moment of psychological vulnerability, Holmes's trap sprung with mechanical precision. The weakened portrait cord, triggered by Richard's involuntary step backward, released a counterweight that activated the tripwire, sending our adversary stumbling directly into Lestrade's waiting grasp. The capture was swift and decisive, ending 20 years of misdirected vengeance with the cold efficiency of justice properly applied. As the constables secured their prisoner, Holmes gathered the evidence that would complete our case: the collapsible stiletto, the aconitine vial, and the brass mechanisms that had made murder appear supernatural. "The truth, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said quietly as the fog began to lift outside the tall windows, "is often more complex than the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions. Your father was indeed innocent, but Sir Charles Ashworth was equally a victim of deception most carefully orchestrated." The devastating truth struck Richard Thorne with the force of a physical blow, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling as Holmes methodically revealed the documents that would forever alter his understanding of the past 20 years. The mechanical device slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering harmlessly upon the polished floor as the young man staggered backward, his face a mask of profound anguish and dawning comprehension. "Marcus Fleming," Holmes continued with quiet authority, withdrawing a leather portfolio from the desk drawer, "was the true architect of your father's ruin. These documents, painstakingly assembled by Sir Charles during his final months, prove beyond question that Fleming systematically embezzled funds while manipulating the partnership's books to implicate both your father and Sir Charles in the inevitable collapse." The evidence was overwhelming in its completeness. Fleming's private correspondence, discovered among Sir Charles's papers, detailed a scheme of breathtaking audacity that had destroyed two innocent men while enriching the very accountant they had trusted with their financial affairs. Bank records showed regular transfers to Fleming's private accounts, disguised through a complex system of false entries that had taken Sir Charles months to unravel. "Your father was indeed innocent, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said with unexpected gentleness, "but so was the man you murdered in his name." Sir Charles spent his final years gathering proof of Fleming's guilt, intending to publish a complete vindication that would restore your father's reputation while accepting responsibility for his own failure to detect the deception earlier. Richard Thorne sank into the nearest chair, his hands covering his face as the magnitude of his error became clear. 20 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible. 20 years of hatred directed at the wrong man. Every skill I acquired, every plan I formulated, every moment of preparation, all founded upon a lie that I never questioned. Holmes moved to the center of the study, his sharp eyes cataloguing the scene with professional precision. "Your mechanical ingenuity was remarkable, Mr. Thorne. The murder weapon itself was a collapsible stiletto of your own design, spring-loaded and attached to the theatrical rigging system you installed throughout this room. The tiny brass fitting beneath the desk served as a guide point for the silk cord that controlled the weapon's deployment and retrieval." With methodical thoroughness, Holmes demonstrated how the impossible crime had been accomplished. The locked room had presented no true obstacle to someone with Richard's theatrical knowledge and engineering expertise. A system of silk cords, nearly invisible and treated with beeswax for smooth operation, had been threaded through carefully drilled holes in the window frame and door jamb. The bolt and chain could be manipulated from outside the room through precise application of leverage and timing. The weapon struck Sir Charles with surgical precision as he sat at his desk, Holmes explained, indicating the exact trajectory. The spring mechanism then retracted the blade into its brass housing, while the silk cord system withdrew the entire apparatus through the prepared opening in the window frame. The device was designed to collapse upon itself, leaving no trace save the minute fragments of metal and oil that our investigation discovered. The blood-stained signature that had so mystified our investigation proved equally ingenious in its simplicity. Richard had compelled Sir Charles to write his father's name at knife point, using the victim's own blood as ink, while maintaining the steady pressure that had convinced us of supernatural intervention. The porcelain cup beside the lamp had served as a reservoir, allowing for the consistent flow necessary to create letters of uniform thickness and spacing. Mr. Whitmore's examination of Sir Charles's revised will revealed the profound irony that completed this tale of misdirected vengeance. The substantial fund established for investor restitution would have publicly acknowledged Elias Thorne's innocence while providing material compensation for those who had suffered losses in the partnership's collapse. Sir Charles had intended to announce this initiative at a ceremony that would have restored the Thorne family's honour before all London society. "Had you approached Sir Charles directly," Holmes observed, "you would have discovered an ally rather than an enemy. The very justice you sought through murder was being prepared through legal channels that would have satisfied every legitimate claim upon your father's memory." Richard Thorne's response demonstrated the complexity of his character despite the terrible nature of his crimes. Rising unsteadily from his chair, he requested permission to place a single white rose upon Sir Charles's grave, acknowledging the innocence of the man he had murdered and seeking whatever forgiveness might be possible for his tragic error. As Inspector Lestrade prepared to escort the prisoner to Scotland Yard, Holmes completed his systematic explanation of the evidence that had led to this resolution. The gentleman's glove with its telltale monogram, the theatrical cord with its distinctive weave, the precision-made pulleys bearing manufacturer's marks. Each clue had contributed to the identification of Richard Thorne as our phantom correspondent. The irony of this case, Holmes reflected as the police wagon disappeared into the London morning, lies not in its mechanical complexity but in its fundamental human simplicity. A son's love for his father's memory became perverted into an instrument of injustice, while the very man he sought to destroy was working to achieve the vindication he desired. Harold Ashworth, pale but resolute after his night's ordeal, demonstrated unexpected nobility by announcing his intention to honour Sir Charles's wishes exactly as originally planned. The restitution fund would proceed as scheduled, with Elias Thorne's vindication serving as a memorial to both men who had suffered under Marcus Fleming's elaborate deception. The fog that had shrouded London throughout our investigation lifted completely as dawn broke over the great city, revealing familiar streets in sharp, clear detail. The supernatural mystery that had baffled Scotland Yard and terrorized the Ashworth household stood exposed as an elaborate mechanical deception, yet the human tragedy at its heart remained as profound as any ghost story ever told. "Watson," Holmes said as we prepared to return to Baker Street, "we have witnessed the transformation of love into hatred, brilliance into criminality, and justice into vengeance. The most remarkable aspect of this case is how completely the truth was hidden, not by supernatural forces, but by the very human tendency to see only what confirms our deepest convictions." As our hansom carried us through the clearing morning air, I reflected upon the profound lessons of our most theatrical case. Richard Thorne's engineering genius, perverted by misdirected purpose, had created what may have been the most ingenious series of crimes we had ever encountered. Yet in the end, it was not supernatural intervention, but human error, the failure to question fundamental assumptions that had led to tragedy. The case of the ghost who signed his name had reached its conclusion, leaving behind a legacy that would fascinate criminologists for years to come, while serving as a sobering reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be led astray by the powerful combination of grief, hatred, and unexamined conviction. The morning after Richard Thorne's arrest brought a transformation to London that seemed to mirror the resolution of our extraordinary case. The persistent fog that had shrouded the great city throughout our investigation lifted completely, revealing familiar streets in sharp, crystalline detail. Holmes and I found ourselves settled before our Baker Street fireplace, the oppressive atmosphere of mystery replaced by the comfortable quiet that follows the successful conclusion of even our most complex adventures. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his violin resting across his knees while his grey eyes reflected the dancing flames. The morning papers lay scattered about our sitting room, their sensational accounts of the ghost who signed his name bearing little resemblance to the methodical investigation that had ultimately revealed the tragic truth behind Richard Thorne's elaborate campaign of vengeance. "A most theatrical affair, Watson," Holmes observed, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between us. The mechanical ingenuity was remarkable, the staging worthy of the finest dramatic productions. Yet the most profound element remains the human tragedy that motivated such extraordinary deception. I found myself reflecting upon the young man whose brilliant mind had been perverted by 20 years of misdirected purpose. The irony is almost unbearable, Holmes. Richard Thorne possessed every quality we might admire: filial devotion, intellectual brilliance, unwavering determination. Yet these very virtues became the instruments of his downfall when applied to a fundamentally false premise. The door opened to admit Mrs. Hudson, bearing word that Harold Ashworth requested permission to call. Within moments, the young man himself appeared, his bearing transformed from the terrified figure we had encountered during our investigation. The ordeal had wrought a profound change in Harold's character, replacing his previous frivolity with a dignity and sense of purpose that would have pleased his late uncle. "Gentlemen," Harold began, settling into the chair we offered, "I come not merely to express my gratitude for your extraordinary efforts, but to share news that I believe will interest you both. Uncle Charles's restitution fund has attracted attention throughout the empire. The investors who suffered under Marcus Fleming's deception will receive compensation that exceeds even my uncle's generous provisions." Holmes received this intelligence with quiet satisfaction, though I detected in his expression the melancholy that often accompanied our most complex cases. "Justice served even if delayed by 20 years. Your uncle would have been gratified to know that his final act achieved such complete vindication of an innocent man's memory." Harold's visit brought additional revelations that cast the entire affair in an even more poignant light. The authorities had finally located Marcus Fleming, now an elderly man living under an assumed name in Brighton, his ill-gotten gains long since dissipated through poor investments and dissolute living. The evidence Sir Charles had so painstakingly assembled would ensure that Fleming faced prosecution for his decades-old crimes, providing a final measure of justice for both Elias Thorne and the investors who had trusted him. "The true tragedy," Holmes observed after Harold's departure, "extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass the destruction of a potentially great mind. Richard Thorne's engineering notebooks reveal designs that could have revolutionized both theatrical production and industrial manufacturing. His brilliance, properly directed, might have contributed significantly to human progress rather than the elaborate machinery of revenge." The afternoon post brought official confirmation of Richard Thorne's sentence, transportation to the Australian colonies, where his engineering skills might yet serve constructive purposes under proper supervision. The Home Secretary's office had taken into account both his complete confession and the tragic circumstances that had motivated his crimes, tempering justice with mercy in a manner that reflected the complexity of the case. "Perhaps," Holmes mused, examining this final communication, "there remains hope that brilliance misdirected might yet find redemption through honest labor and the passage of time. The colonies have often provided second chances for those whose talents were initially perverted by circumstance." As evening settled over London, Holmes rose from his chair and moved to examine once more the evidence we had gathered during our investigation. The collapsible stiletto, the theatrical rigging components, the forged correspondence. Each item represented hours of meticulous preparation devoted to a cause that proved fundamentally unjust. The locked room mystery that so baffled Inspector Lestrade, Holmes reflected, handling the brass pulley mechanism with professional interest, proves remarkably simple once the proper perspective is achieved. Richard Thorne's theatrical background provided knowledge of rigging systems that could manipulate objects at a distance, while his engineering expertise allowed him to miniaturize these principles for domestic application. The case had demonstrated the remarkable lengths to which human ingenuity could extend when motivated by powerful emotion. The mechanical systems Richard had devised rivaled anything we had encountered in our previous investigations, while his ability to manipulate physical evidence and create apparently supernatural effects showed a mastery of misdirection that would have impressed the finest stage magicians of our time. Holmes returned to his chair as the fire settled into comfortable embers, reaching for his violin with that distant expression I had learned to associate with his most profound reflections upon human nature and criminal motivation. "Watson, this case has reminded me once again that the most dangerous criminals are often those whose crimes spring from the noblest motives perverted by false information or misdirected passion." He drew the bow across the strings in a haunting melody that seemed to capture both the melancholy and the satisfaction that accompanied the resolution of our most complex case. The music filled our sitting room with echoes of human tragedy and redemption, while outside our windows the clear evening air revealed London in all its bustling vitality. "The supernatural, my dear fellow, is merely the natural unexplained," Holmes said quietly, as the final notes faded into silence. Our ghost proved to be entirely human, his apparent powers extending only to the realm of mechanical ingenuity and theatrical misdirection. Yet the emotions that drove his son to such extraordinary lengths remain as mysterious and powerful as any supernatural force we might encounter. As I prepared my notes for what would become one of our most memorable adventures, I reflected upon the profound lessons embedded within this tragic tale. The case had illustrated how completely brilliant individuals could be led astray by unexamined assumptions and the powerful emotions that accompany personal loss. Richard Thorne had never questioned the fundamental premise of his father's innocence or Sir Charles's guilt, instead building an elaborate structure of vengeance upon foundations that proved entirely false. "The lesson, if there is one," Holmes observed, setting aside his violin, "is that conviction, however strong, must always be tempered by inquiry. Truth, however painful, remains preferable to the most comforting of illusions." The clock upon our mantelpiece chimed the hour as London settled into its nightly rhythm, the great city's countless inhabitants pursuing their individual destinies while remaining largely unconscious of the complex dramas that played out in drawing rooms and locked studies throughout the metropolis. Our own small part in this vast human theatre had concluded, leaving behind a legacy that would long fascinate students of both criminal methodology and human psychology. "Another case concluded, Watson," Holmes said with characteristic understatement, though I detected in his voice the satisfaction that always accompanied the successful resolution of a truly challenging mystery. Though I confess this particular affair has left me with more questions about human nature than answers about criminal technique. As the familiar sounds of evening London drifted through our windows, the clip-clop of hansom cabs, the distant cry of newspaper vendors, the gentle murmur of a great city settling into night, I found myself grateful once again for the privilege of witnessing Holmes's extraordinary methods applied to the most perplexing of mysteries. The ghost of Elias Thorne had been laid to rest at last, not through supernatural intervention, but through the methodical application of logic, observation, and unwavering dedication to truth. The case of the ghost who signed his name had reached its conclusion, serving as a sobering reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions ultimately yield to patient investigation and clear thinking. In the end, it stood as testament to the principle that justice, however delayed, need not be denied, provided that brilliant minds and steadfast hearts are brought to bear upon even the most seemingly impossible of mysteries. "The game, as always, remains afoot," Holmes murmured, with that familiar glint of anticipation in his grey eyes. "And I dare say London will provide us with another puzzle before long, one that demands all our powers of observation and deduction to unravel." With that promise of future adventures hanging in the air like the last notes of his violin, we settled into the comfortable routine of our Baker Street evenings, secure in the knowledge that whatever mysteries the great city might present, they would find us ready to meet them with the full force of reason, method, and unwavering pursuit of truth.